Chapter 4. The Rogue Hunter. Former members, Jo said, almost under her breath, not intending to say anything out loud. The hooded figure took it as a question, however, and he answered it. Aye, the hooded figure explained, and what is referred to within our organization as a rogue hunter. We are well respected within the Soul Takers for being so skilled that we can even hunt down and defeat our own. Our organization is tight-knit and prides loyalty above most things, and yet there are still occasions when members break away. Such rogues are dangerous to our leader's goals, and so he dispatches rogue hunters like me to deal with them in whichever way we see fit. But why, Jo asked, speaking tentatively, are you after Karen, and Monty and Lawrence? You're smarter than that, Hoodie sniped before answering her anyway. Obviously, if I call them former members of the Soul Takers, and I explain that I hunt rogue members, then I'm after them because they went rogue. It was shortly after their encounter with you dueling hearts. They returned to their base for a short time, but before even reporting on whether or not they had confirmed you as bearers of the soul, they left again. Maybe they left to find your leader a different soul snack, Sarah snarked. They wouldn't have, Hoodie replied, not without being assigned to, or at the very least declaring their intentions ahead of time. And if they had simply left base, that would be one thing. The issue is that they made it abundantly clear when they left that they didn't intend to come back. When they left, he explained, despite not being on assignment, they made off with a pair of artifacts imprinted with one of our leader's techniques. The one to absorb soul from others and store it, Jo surmised. Strangely enough, no, the hooded young man replied. Otherwise, I would assume that they intended to attack you again of their own volition. Maybe they felt that they had in some way failed against you. Maybe they wanted to remedy that mistake. That might have been something that could be forgiven. Instead, they took artifacts with a different ability, a pair of rings imprinted with the ability to identify a bearer of the ancient soul by seeing them fight in a heated heart-to-heart. But, Sarah protested, finally showing real interest in the conversation, I thought the three of them had that ability already. They had it gifted to them by our leader, Hoodie explained, but gifts like that don't remain with you for long. 3 weeks at most. But the rings are different. The technique is etched right onto them. They'll wear it out eventually, but that won't be for years. Again, he insisted, I don't care if you four are bearers of the ancient soul or not. It's not my business. But if Karen and her team have fought you, then they already know whether you bear the soul. They wouldn't need to check again, and yet you four are the last people outside of the organization that they had any contact with. I don't know what business they would have with you, Hoodie concluded, though Jo got the impression that he at least suspected. But it is reasonable to assume that they left with the intention of approaching you four again. If nothing else, working off of that assumption gives me a place to start. So, in short, I'm here to ask, have Karen, Monty, or Lawrence approached any of you since your last confrontation with them 2 months ago? No, Sarah insisted immediately, but Hoodie was looking at Jo, not her sister. She's right, Jo agreed. She didn't want to go as far as to tell him that she and her friends had made a deal with Karen and her allies, to leave them alone if the dueling hearts defeated them. That seemed like too much information. However, this line of questioning did remind her of her conversation with Karen, and the last thing that Karen had said to her. And you'll keep your promise? Jo asked, and leave us alone? You won't just show up again in a week and try this again? Yeah, I'll keep my word, with one exception. We won't attack you again, but I still doubt that this is the last you've seen of the three of us. Ever since that night, Jo had been wondering what Karen meant by those words, and now this hooded rogue hunter was telling her that he suspected that Karen and her allies had left the Soul Takers to come after the dueling hearts again. None of this made any sense at all, and Jo didn't even know what information she might be missing to change that. She just continued to glare at where Hoodie's eyes might be, and wonder if he knew that she was keeping something from him. Finally, Hoodie spoke again. All right, he told her. I choose to believe that. But I still suspect that my former colleagues might feel that they have further business with you. If you suspect that they might be nearby, or they approach you, it would be in your own best interest to return here. I'll be waiting if you do. Understand that, as of right now, the Soul Takers have no interest in you, he explained. I can't make promises for the future, but our interests are currently elsewhere. However, if you choose to defy me in this and protect Karen, Monty, and Lawrence, you will attract the full attention of my organization. Think about what is best for your friends and your family. Without another word, he shot off in a puff of smoke, leaving Jo feeling genuinely rattled. As she let her aura fade, Sarah likewise letting go of the energy that life from the earth had overcharged her with. The halo of light around her disappeared, and she gasped as if she had been holding her breath for too long. This is bad, she said. We have to get back and make sure Jen and Tucker are okay, and then we need to figure out how to deal with this. Unable to take Sarah with her while shadow stepping, Jo was restricted to her sister's speed as they made their way back to the Mega Dojo. Thankfully, it was close enough that they were able to see it as soon as they crossed the tree line, looming across a single 4-lane road and an open field. It wouldn't take long at all to get back, but it did give them time to talk a bit, Sarah explaining how she had tried to follow Joe, failing up until she saw Joe's soul breaker shoot off into the sky. By the time the two sisters arrived at the Mega Dojo again, they found Jen and Tucker standing outside waiting for them. The four of them didn't need to say anything. They walked together to the nearest bus stop and got on the next bus headed toward Joe and Sarah's neighborhood. On the bus, Joe and Sarah caught Jen and Tucker up on what had happened. Tucker almost lost control of his fire soul and melted his seat when he heard that Joe had been stabbed. "So he really was with the Soul Takers," Jen remarked thoughtfully, the gears turning noisily in her head. "I'm sorry, Joe," Tucker told her, his voice quivering. "I should have followed Sarah, but you were hurt," Joe interjected, finishing his thought for him, "and you figured that we had it handled, and we did. He put us through the ringer, but we're alive, and we're okay. You have nothing to apologize for." "So we're going to discuss this with Wilson, then," Jen confirmed. "Yeah," Joe replied. "I figured it's the best option at this point. He still knows more about the Soul Takers than any of us do." Jen nodded her understanding. She had come to the same conclusion herself, of course. The Dueling Hearts rode the rest of the way in relative silence, each of them internalizing the reality of the day in their own ways. In another 10 minutes or so, the bus arrived at the stop closest to Wilson's, and they unloaded, walking the rest of the way there. Jo was the first to the dojo. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. "I wasn't expecting you back again so soon," Wilson said cheerfully from across the large main room where he was picking up the last of the debris from Joe's earlier training. He turned to look at her, growing wary when he saw her teammates with her. Then, when Jo untied the sleeves of her black overshirt from around her waist, where she'd tied them very deliberately, Wilson saw the blood on her clothes. His eyes grew wide with shock and then narrowed, projecting a level of seriousness that the old man saved for special occasions. "Tell me what happened," he demanded, and the Dueling Hearts recounted their story yet again. "This is rather troubling," Wilson told the Dueling Hearts. The four of them were sitting in a half circle in some of the folding chairs that Wilson kept against the wall by the door. Wilson, meanwhile, was pacing back and forth more energetically than one might expect given his aged appearance. "If he's telling the truth," Joe reminded him, "then we really shouldn't have anything to worry about. He's said that he isn't like Karen and the others. He doesn't care if we have the ancient soul. As long as Karen doesn't show up again, he should leave us alone." "If his responsibilities really do end where he claims they do," Wilson muttered thoughtfully, almost too quiet to hear, "then he may very well be telling the truth, but that makes him no less dangerous." "And what if Karen and her friends do show up?" Sarah asked. "What do we do if we think they might be following us again, or if they show themselves to us?" "We tell Hoodie about it and send him after them, obviously," Tucker asserted, as if the question wasn't even worth asking. When he saw Joe and Sarah looking at him questioningly, he asked, "What? They attacked us. They don't deserve our sympathies here." "They attacked us because they were forced to by that leader guy they keep talking about," Sarah countered with absolute certainty. "That's what they told us," Tucker argued. "But they could have been lying. That Lawrence guy didn't seem at all reluctant." "Oh yeah," Sarah snapped. "Like we don't know anyone who gets overeager about fighting." "Are you comparing me to the guy who stabbed me through my torso? Really?" Tucker demanded. He stood up slowly. The air around him began to grow hot, and his eyes had a red glow to them. Sarah looked down at her feet, not meeting his gaze. Joe and Jen looked at her with shocked expressions. "Yeah," she finally replied. Okay, that was too far. I'm sorry. I was just trying to make the point that those guys didn't seem evil or bad or whatever. They seemed like people doing a job that they didn't even really want to do. Lawrence seemed all gung-ho about the fighting part, but maybe that's just how he makes the job bearable." "This is insane," Tucker exclaimed. "I know that Monty was pretty cool to you when you fought him, Sarah, that he was all gentlemanly or whatever, but that doesn't change that these guys made the choice to join some group that hunts people down and attacks them. It sounded like they even kill people sometimes." "We don't know that they chose to join the Soul Takers," Jen interjected thoughtfully. "They almost certainly didn't," Wilson agreed, and suddenly the eyes of all four Dueling Hearts were on him again. "When the Soul Takers emerged for the first time 17 years ago, he explained, the majority of their leaders' ranks was filled with young people who either didn't have families at all, or who were rejected by their families. Many of them had been raised in the organization. They believed in it and were loyal to it not because it was their choice, but because it was their family. It is likely the same way now." "Well," Tucker replied, his soul dissipating as he sat down again, "that really sounds like something you could have told us before I made an ass of myself." Unable to help herself, Jo snickered, saying, "Why? You would have just found another way." "I apologize," Wilson interjected, which was odd, considering that Wilson rarely apologized for anything. "I didn't recall this detail until just now, when I was reminded of it by the direction of our conversation." "And this doesn't change anything anyway," Tucker asserted. "They're still our enemies. If they show up and we don't tell Hoodie about it, we're taking a risk that we don't have to take. It isn't worth it. They aren't worth it. You're not wrong, Jen told him, which seemed to surprise Tucker. It would be a risk. That isn't the only risk in this situation. What do you mean? Joe asked her. You told us, Jen replied, that the rogue hunter told you that Karen and her friends left before reporting in about their mission. Their mission being to observe us. That means that they never told anyone in the Soul Takers what they did or didn't discover about us. That means, Jen concluded, that the Soul Takers still don't know if we have ancient souls. Even if the rogue hunter doesn't care about that stuff, the Soul Takers as a whole still do. They're going to send someone else after us eventually. Joe felt like she'd been slapped. Sarah and Tucker looked about the same. How had none of them thought about that? Even before today, Karen and her allies had never said that they would lie to their fellow Soul Takers about whether the Dueling Hearts possessed that ancient energy that their leader needed to survive. The Soul Takers were always going to return. That return had just come sooner, and in a different form than it could have. Joe looked over at Wilson, a troubling thought entering her mind. Did you know? She asked him, hoping against hope that she was wrong about the answer. Wilson wouldn't meet her eyes as he spoke his reply. I suspected, he admitted, but I hoped that I was wrong. I hoped that your recent encounter with the Soul Takers would be your last. But how could I know for sure? I should have shared my suspicions with you all, but I didn't want you to spend the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders if you didn't have to. Joe nodded. She couldn't blame Wilson for that, even if it hadn't actually helped Joe resolve her fears on the matter. She'd worried ever since Karen had walked away from their final heart-to-heart that wasn't really the end. She had just never considered that the threat would come from different Soul Takers than those three. She couldn't explain, even to herself, how this situation was making her feel. Sick wasn't quite the right word, though her stomach was churning uncomfortably, and her hands were shaking just enough that she was aware of it, but not so much that the others had noticed yet. She clenched her fists, forcing them to be still, and took a deep breath, but this had the unfortunate effect of implying to the others that she had something to say. She looked up and saw them staring at her expectantly. At first, Joe just stared back. What did they expect her to say? It wasn't like she had some insight into the situation that the others didn't. Thankfully, Jen answered Joe's unspoken question, asking, What do you think we should do if Karen and her friends actually show up? Did you believe the rogue hunter when he said they were the only ones he wanted? Joe understood now. She was the leader of the Dueling Hearts as a competitive team of fighters. That didn't include leading them in situations like this, and yet the others expected her to make the final call. Joe didn't want that kind of responsibility, but at the same time, she didn't want her friends to have to take on that kind of responsibility either. I did believe him, she answered. She wasn't sure what to say next. She knew that all of her friends, not just Jen, were expecting an opinion on Karen and her allies. Joe's first instinct was to defend Karen, and Monty and Lawrence by extension, but she hesitated to say so. Whenever she thought about selling out Karen to the Hooded Fighter, she started to panic. Her feelings for Karen were clouding her judgment. She couldn't be objective in this situation, but her friends didn't know that. They couldn't know that, because they didn't have all of the information. Joe met the eyes of the other Dueling Hearts in turn. She wondered if they could see how anxious she felt. It was like a battle was being waged in her chest. She had to tell her friends the truth, but she wasn't sure if she could bear to do so. It would change the way they saw her forever, in more ways than one. Telling them could make the situation worse, as much as it made it better. She looked up at Wilson, desperately hoping that he would have something to say in her stead, but he was watching her with as much interest as the others. He wanted to know her opinion on the matter as well. I don't know what we should do, Joe finally choked out. She hesitated, trying not to fumble over her words. I don't know if we can turn them into Hoodie. If they do show up again, I think it'll depend on what they do and what they want from us. If they want our help, she tried not to sound too hopeful that was the case. Would it really be right if we just brushed them off and put them in danger? It would be safer, Tucker reminded her, and at his side, Jen seemed to agree. Yeah, Joe admitted, sounding more confident now that she had a point to argue against. But would it be right? We aren't the Soul Takers. They're the ones who don't care if someone is killed because of their actions. Not us. That put Tucker squarely in his place. He looked away from Joe, ashamed, refusing to meet her eyes. She had implied much the same as Sarah had, that Tucker and Lawrence might not be too different, and though she meant it as a cautionary warning and not an accusation, his reaction to his best friend saying it was profoundly different. Okay, Tucker told her after a long, painful pause, during which Joe almost took the words back. Fine. I'm okay with waiting and seeing what happens before we decide. But if it ends up that turning them in is the best choice, and you all decide to keep defending the people who literally attacked us, I'm gonna go to Hoodie myself. He looked over at Joe and met her eyes. His gaze was fierce and resentful. It startled her, but she didn't look away. She didn't feel like she deserved to. The others present had never seen Joe and Tucker so at odds, and they didn't know what to think about it. Finally, Joe nodded agreement, and a lot of the tension in the room disappeared. "Okay," Sarah asked, sitting back in her chair and crossing her arms. "We'll see what they want, if they come back. That's all well and good, but what are we going to do in the meantime? We have lives to live. We can't just put everything aside until we know how this is going to play out." Jen nodded. "It's pretty much the same situation as 2 months ago. We can't spend the rest of our lives running from these guys, so we have to decide how to move forward as things are. Honestly, I think the best option this time is to continue with business as usual, at least for the time being. Obviously," she added, "we have the same option as the last time we knew that the Soul Takers were coming. We can train again and prepare as much as possible. But I think that would be a mistake. As of right now, the rogue hunter can't be sure if we're aware that we're in danger from more than just him. If we begin training more than usual, it may send him the message that we're preparing to attack him." "We should be, though," Joe argued. "Training, I mean. Even if we don't intend to fight him, we should be ready in case we have to. We still don't know that he's telling the truth. This could all be a trick. If he forces our hand, we need to be ready." "Then we should find a way to prepare without making it obvious," Jen surmised. "I've been training to improve my soul manipulation," Joe explained. "If I keep going with that, I should be able to refocus that training toward finding a way to counter Hoodie's techniques without making it obvious. The rest of you should start trying to work extra maneuverability training into your regular workouts, and we should all keep working on improving our sixth sense techniques." "That's a sound plan," Wilson agreed, looking contemplative. "You should also continue to compete as usual. I know that you," he looked at Joe, "have plans to meet with and recruit 2 members to your team. You should go forward with that plan." "Wouldn't bringing other people onto the team right now put them in danger?" Tucker asked. "The Soul Takers are not after the Dueling Hearts as a specific entity," Wilson replied. "They're after you 4. If they wish to put someone in danger to get to you, they're more likely to target your loved ones than your teammates." "That's comforting," Sarah remarked sardonically. "As long as you don't reveal any of this to them," Wilson continued, "these additional team members should be safe enough. They would be in at least a marginal amount of danger from the Soul Takers anyway if they are at all strong. Having you 4 at their backs would actually leave them safer than they would normally be." "There's also," Jen added, "the possibility that any new members that we bring on might be willing and able to help us fight the Soul Takers when they come back." "We can't ask them to do that," Joe argued, though she felt like a hypocrite, since if Jen had made the suggestion, Joe would have. "Of course we can't," Jen agreed, "but let's say, for example, that these hypothetical teammates find out about the Soul Takers, or know about them already, or even turn out to be bearers of more of the ancient soul fragments. They might choose to fight all on their own. Fighting alongside us against the Soul Takers would be safer than fighting alone." Joe didn't like it. She had half hoped that Jen would be able to quash the idea, but, as usual, she was unable to fault her cousin's logic. It was really kind of annoying. As the only one who knew who the 2 potential fighters were, at least Joe knew that they could handle themselves as well as any current member of the Dueling Hearts. Joe paused, organizing her thoughts, and then made the choice to embrace her role as team leader, even in situations like this, by announcing, "All right, then it's settled. We wait until Karen returns, if she even does, before we decide what to do about Hoodie and his demands. We train to fight Hoodie, but we do it in secret, and we go ahead with recruiting to the team. We go ahead with living our lives. And more than anything, we can't let this mess with who we are." Joe met Tucker's eyes again, and he gave her a little sideways smile and nodded. Without it having to be said, all 4 Dueling Hearts knew that the conversation was over and that it was time to leave. But even as they did, Joe could already feel what was coming. She stood, along with the others, and turned toward the door, and there was Karen standing on the other side of it, watching them through the glass. As stunning as she ever was, Karen's confident smirk spread across her lips. She did a little salute and darted off. Seeing her, Joe gasped, and before she even realized what she was doing, she followed.